Welcome to Warblog. Today we're looking at Harad 2019, which is part of the Yemen civil war. There we go. It's what I call a stonker. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Okay. So, just to sort of state the obvious, it's a pocket. It's sort of like this, really. So there's the Saudi-led coalition, or it's called the Hadi government, and then here we got the Houthi side. Who I can never remember how it works really, but I'm pretty sure the Houthi was the original government, and there was a revolution, and the Hadi government took over. But the Hadi government is the internationally recognised government, but the Houthis are sort of loyalists to the pre-existing government. Probably more in there than you might possibly think there should be. Let's use white. The thing that one of the things that sort of intrigues me, I didn't really notice at first, is this sort of river and Wadi Harad. It sort of goes like this. Now it's crossable there because it's just stream. It's got a bridge there, and a bridge there. So I think that marks quite a significant element of this sort of geographic, the strategic geography. Because this northern area is probably not worth a huge amount. I mean, there's no real locations there. So that might be why this sort of area is sort of as it is, because you might have thought that, well, the Saudi Arabian forces would sort of put more pressure on from here. So this acts as a sort of a natural delineator between the northern part of it and the southern part of it. Now they're pushing in this way, trying to take Hadi, which is there, but presumably they could. There's a reason why the front line exists along this sort of relatively open terrain and also across here. There's an interesting sort of geographical feature of this hill that sort of comes down here with this sort of river passing through it. So that's interesting. Now, other parts. Oh look, he's on the wrong side. He should be on that side, shouldn't he? It should be more like that, but it doesn't matter. One part. Well, I think what's sort of again the next thing. I sort of get on with this boring regularity really. Is you've got to start thinking really, and I just thrown these counters down, like a bunch of random things. So whether there's any balance one side or the other, I don't really know. But there is a large Saudi force here, and presumably that is just going to pile straight through here, and very possibly it will. But I think what you've got to sort of possibly consider and state before playing it, depending on how well we define it to be easy or not, is how much loss you can take as the Saudi player and maintain a sort of degree of victory in that instance. I say that because there's got to be a reason why they just don't plough in there and why they just don't plough in through everywhere. And I think a lot of it is because they sort of suffer the risk of losing quite significant forces, if they do that, and that's got to be why they're sort of not doing these sorts of things, because you would have thought with superior arms that they could do that. And I was reading somewhere actually just recently that the Saudis are having a hard time of it fighting a sort of a war where they've got technical superiority. And I think this is probably biased reporting, but it's what it was saying, against the sort of relatively unarmed opposition, the Houthis. No one really knows what's going on, and there's a lot of sort of bias in reporting. Whether or not the Houthis are being heavily armed by the Iranians, which is what a lot of reporting will say. I imagine that they are to some extent, because otherwise they just run out of ammunition in all insurgencies. And anything like this, someone has got to be supplying. I mean, you're either supplying themselves through their own sort of military-industrial complex. That's probably a little unlikely. There is also the sort of the prospect or the notion or the claim that they're using the resources they had from Yemen initially, but I imagine a lot of that has been used up. A lot of these ballistic missiles came from the sort of whatever stockpiles Yemen had before they went into civil war, and a lot of that was supposed to have come from Iraq. The Scud missiles that they had, etc., etc. And I don't know the full ins and outs of that, but I think it's probably safe to say they're being armed to some extent by the Iranians. So it's like another proxy war in the sense that the Saudis are obviously backing the Hadis, but they're also being obviously provisioned to a larger extent by other forces, in particular the United Kingdom. I know that there's been a bit on that. And I know that clearly the United States is arming Saudi Arabia, which is then in turn waging this war. And there's a lot of sort of hoo-ha about stopping that. And I think there have been sort of efforts in the USA or the UK and or both to actually stop that. So they're not going to fund the war anymore, and claims of crimes against humanity and war crimes going on in support of what the Saudi Arabian alliance with the Hadis is actually doing. The things that they're doing on the ground, etc. I don't know. I mean, it's all you can never read too much into what you read, but obviously the bottom line is that there's reasons why they just don't pile in straight through with superior arms, because they're actually sort of probably fairly well equipped to defend themselves. One thing I haven't put in here, to be quite honest, is a bunch of anti-tank, and I think I'm actually going to do that. So I'll have to start again, but I'm going to put this on pause. I'm going to go away onto the computer in the other room. I'm going to put some anti-tank in there because the Houthis haven't got any, and I think it's quite clear they run around firing anti-tank missiles and things. So I think putting some anti-tank down here would be, it should have been done. So 1 minute. Well, it didn't take me too long, but now I've got to start the game again, which isn't a big problem. Let's see where they are. Look, anti-tank, 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 anti-tank. Okay, so now again, starting from scratch, you've got to start thinking, well, okay, well let's consider this, because that's where the push is coming. I mean, we could think about what could be done here. And over here. So, I mean, if we were to look at it, say, strategically or tactically or whatever you want to sort of think, we've got this front here. How fast can this push? How far can that push? If it chose to. We got this sort of element over here. I mean, how far could they push? We got this sort of thing here. I mean, how far could they push? Now, I think here it's going to be tight. It's going to be tight. It's going to be tight. They could possibly do something, but here is the sort of, this is the front line, so to speak, and obviously this is where the action is. So if we consider that, my Wi-Fi is a bit slow for some reason, but oh well. But if we consider that, what's that button? What's that for? Oh, it's multiplayer. Okay. I think the first thing to sort of do is to look at what we've got. So we really only have what looks like 2 or 3 units in there. But there's only one there and one there. So to some extent, we could sort of go, if this was our driving force, we could sort of punch this way and this way. And what that would leave us is the ability to sort of come in almost going around that and just punching straight through. Now that sounds very sort of grand and specific, and I think my plans along these lines often fall to bits when you consider the amount of movement that things have. But that sounds to me like a plan. So how to achieve it in the first instance? Well, the thing is, we've got air power, but not a lot of it. But I think what we've got to consider is, and I think early on in the video, what I considered was, what I said was, how much can you allow yourself to take as damage? Because again, we're fighting, theoretically with all these units, but, and I've often said this, but they can't afford to take much damage, in the sense these wars are not hidden as much as they used to be. Like even the Korean War, where they could, you could lose 90% of a company or a battalion, or even a regiment, 90% of a regiment, and it was just like, that was how war was, collateral damage. And I don't think they can allow for the for news to be coming back from the front line that they lost 90% of anything. And so what they have to do to some extent is have any maneuver 100% guaranteed with no losses. So that means to some extent, you might be able to get, say, this line, supposing we can breach that line and end up there. What are we then going to have attacking us? We're going to have anti-tank, we're going to have artillery, the Houthi artillery only has a range of 2, so obviously it won't be able to fire that far, but they'll be able to move. More anti-tank, and of course a lot of, well, they won't be able to gain, a lot of sort of irregular units coming in and popping away at some of these. Now, I might go back and put more in, but the thing is, that's what we got. So we've got this massive confusion of effort going on here, which I'd be interested to see how it pans out. So let's just see about that first prong. Can we get rid of these? Now, we've got some air power. Did I have any artillery down here? Until I just threw this together because there's no artillery. Okay, I'm going to make some more adjustments. I'm going to give the Saudis some artillery, but I'm also going to beef up the Houthis by putting these both up to like stacks of 4. Why not? 1 minute. Okay, so I've made some more adjustments, so let's start again and see what it looks like. So we've got big stacks there. But we've got this artillery here. And I've also stacked these up as well. But the gameplay is going to be the same. So, positioning artillery. Oh, as long as we're within 5 of all these, I think we'll be okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we really want to be there, possibly there. What's the going to play mode? Okay, so probably be able to get into there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Probably won't be able to hit that. Okay, well, let's just move this guy there. Now, one thing that's worth bearing in mind that I forgot to reference is that the Houthis have drones. I don't know why I gave them drones, but they seem to have drones. But they're not very powerful. Okay, so we've got artillery and we've got air power. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we can hit that. So let's try and take that out. Well, that's a good start for the Houthis. What's the point of getting out of bed in the mornings? I wonder if this is a newfangled American artillery or British artillery that they're using. So, there you have it. I mean, this is why it's difficult, because they're pounding them with artillery, just like you see on YouTube, and they're still there. They haven't been completely decimated. So, what do we do? Well, I feel like really trying to make sure we get something on that. So let's just see what the air power can do. And hopefully we won't get shot out of the sky. We've got 2 of these things in defense. 0.1. He's Superman or something. 0.2, 0.2. Let's try some helicopters. This might be a bit more dangerous. Nothing and nothing. My God. That is... It's like one big bag of drivel. Well, it's going to take all our effort just to punch this one thing out. So, how do we want to play this? I want to get as much as I can through here, but there's a zone of control, so zones of control are going to affect where we can get. So essentially there's a zone of control there, 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 there. So we cannot get there, and we cannot get there. So we can only get to here and here. We can stack 4 in there, 4 in there. So we want to get as much good stuff in there as we can, so that guy can go. And it cost him, he's got 1.5 left. So most of this is infantry. But we've got some armour in there, so let's move that ahead. Joint operations, why not? Okay, so that's 4 in there. And 4 in there. So that's about as good as we can get. Now hopefully if we can push that out of the way, we can at least try and get into there, etc. So let's just see what these odds end up being like. Now we've got mechanized, so it's going to give us a boost. We've got armor, that's going to give us a boost. We've got a 10% surround. I can't be bothered to count it. It should be good. I'm guessing 3 or 4 to 1. How far can I be off on that mark? 3, yep. And an exchange. Oh, you know, I mean, this is how the battles work, in my opinion. I think it's good reflection on things, because it doesn't have to be technically correct. You know, we've had some heavy fighting, and that was not what the Saudi coalition want, because they've had an exchange, which means they probably lost some troops. Now, they haven't lost any units there, but this whole campaign could just come to a stop now, and this is what I think happens. You know, they sort of, you know, unless they can get the momentum. Now, they held out for 2 reasons. Firstly, this is the nature of the game, but secondly, because I doubled them up. If I hadn't doubled them up, that would have probably been a bit of more of a walkover. Now, it was a 3 to 1. Now, those are good odds, and we rolled a 12, which is the crappiest result you could have. So that could, generally speaking, that would have worked, and we'd be in a different situation. But we've come up with a sort of a situation where this Houthi front line is held, and you sort of think, well, how can a Houthi front line hold when they're just they're just irregulars, etc., etc. But that's sort of the nature of the game, really. Now, I don't think we're going to be able to get towards this one at all. 1, 2, 3, 4. We might be able to, because we're going along roads. We've got some units here. We don't want to go through the minefield. But we might be able to go like this. Let's just see what the distance is like. Yeah, that's good. So we can move this entire stack here. Now, of course, we've not got any prep on this, so... And we probably won't get any mechanized or armor in there. We might. Then we can get this unit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, possibly in there. Yes. I don't think he's going to get there. With 0.4 left. Can the mechanized do it as well? Yes. So we might have some good odds. Possibly a 2 to 1, maybe touching on that 3 to 1. Three to 1, and we've got the DR. So that's good. So one of our battles turned out okay. But it's interesting because it's just pushed the line just slightly back. It hasn't really made sort of this sort of massive breakthrough result that you might have thought. So instead of being like this, the line is now like this. But they're not entrenched, so they've been pushed out and they're going to be a lot weaker. So we can't move these units any further forward. Unless we sort of push them into that minefield, which you don't want to do. I'm going to leave them as they are. But I guess we can push these along the road. We can stack them in there. So they can't pass through those because they're stacked out. I'm going to leave them there. I'm going to push these guys into that stack. Basically because I want to give myself some options, and I don't want to overstack where I don't necessarily have to, because they do have air power. We've got some air defense. So that's that. I'm not going to do anything else because I just don't want to commit that much mental effort everywhere else. But I think that's quite a nice turn. Giving us a fairly congested front line, but you know. So I think we could sit there and sort of discuss permutations on that. Not that there are too many, but you know, that's sort of quite an effort. We had 3-1 on both ones. One worked, one didn't, and the significance of that is quite telling, really. You know, we could have failed on both of these and looking stupid, but we've won on this one, so the Saudis could sort of claim, you know, the right for another round. Whereas if we'd failed at both of them, we would have probably said, well, we're not doing not going any further. And I think this is something that's critical in the sense of the role play element to it, because I mean, modern war is different in many regards, but I think the acceptable loss issue is different. What I'm balancing up here is the concept of reality with the nature of war games, because quite often, you know, I'm trying to think on this, but people just throw units away, and there's, you know, it's not games will have morale, and that is a significant thing. They also have sort of, you know, roles to see what you can move and things like that. I don't like any of that. It just restricts sort of, you know, the ease of gameplay. And it doesn't really add anything, in my opinion, to sort of reality when you can role play it. You know, sort of say, well, if we didn't win both of these, well, we would have to stop. You know, which is equivalent to a sort of morale check based on sort of, you know, sort of, you know, an unwritten rule stating that, you know, obviously we're not just gonna. This isn't Korea, you know, where they were throwing units at each other. They weren't necessarily doing that so readily in Vietnam, but there was a lot of loss in Vietnam. I think Vietnam is a really interesting war to compare with not so much Afghanistan, but the Iran-Iraq war. You know, where they had these human waves of soldiers, and they'd lose 100,000 men over a weekend. You know, and they just, I don't think they could do that these days. I think a lot of it's got to be sort of special forces doing this, special forces doing that, you know, air forces doing this with smart bombs. It's all got to be surgical and precise, and you know, this whole sort of no one no one other than the intended participants are injured. Um, I think that's one of the ways that war has changed, unless it's indirect. This is why in Libya they're losing a lot of drones and air power and artillery, and that's they just keep doing that until they feel that they can actually make ground assaults. The whole idea of making courageous ground assaults just doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. Not really. What I often find quite interesting, and going off on a bit of a tangent here, is what would happen if this was, say, the United States doing this with these resources, these men that they were trained, say, to US doctrine levels. I don't want to say the US are better, because I think that's a bit misleading. I just think that they are, to some extent, are better, but it's a psychological difference. Not so much it's psychological. The training is different. The military doctrine is different, to the extent that they would have planning, and I think that's maybe something that's lacking. Now, I'm not saying they're lacking this planning in this effort, in this instance, like the Saudis don't plan things, but I think the levels of planning are different, in that. And so what I'm saying is, I don't want to sort of criticize, either side too readily, but if suddenly you could just teleport all these US commanders in, to actually carry out that operation, what would they do differently? Why is it that they would do that and it would work? I mean, what would they do? They'd sort of have this sort of blitzkrieg of air power, followed by a sort of a massive rush of tanks, like the Hell's Highway going through Iraq, just driving straight up through there, to get to the, not worrying about everything on the way. I've seen some of the videos of that. They're just driving down the motorway, and the occasional anti-tank missile will come out. But it's interesting the way they did those things. And I'm just wondering, how they would do it differently. I mean, I often think of that, in the Iran-Iraq war. And one thing I've noticed that is missing, and I'm not sure how this would work. I'm not saying that it's the Americans would do something like this, but it's this sort of notion of air mobility, and the whole thing in the Vietnam War was like, creating these hammer anvil type things where they would use, air mobile units to sort of land in here, or to cut off other things, maybe to take out these anti-tank units, or, to come in here and take out this air defense unit, or to come in here to cut off their line of retreat and come in here and just, to sort of stop them from reinforcing. But you don't see much air mobile conflict in what you might have thought would be a perfect terrain for air mobile warfare, just maneuvering troops, especially in Syria. Why doesn't the Syrian army just use a lot more helicopters? I mean, it could be that they're worried about them getting shot down, but it seems to me that that's always been a risk. And I do think that in Vietnam, the Americans had a heyday, a golden period of air mobility in helicopters without the massive, devastating effect of the sort of surface-to-air missile technology that came out for the Afghanistan war. Because obviously the Soviets were trying to do the same sort of thing, but all of a sudden they had all these like Stinger missiles that were taking out every helicopter. I mean, if the Viet Cong had the degree of Stinger missiles, would that have changed things? Because basically Vietnam was the evolution of air mobility. That was the first time they were using helicopters. They were almost experimental, and they were using them to good effect. And I'm just sort of thinking, well, maybe there's reasons why they're not using them here. But I would be always inclined to sort of think about, how could you do that? I mean, the French do it, the US do it. I'm talking about in places like Mali. They'll put in some special forces at strategic locations to cut off roads, and then maybe even airlift them out afterwards. But it would seem to me that you could combine those arms, but there doesn't seem to be that much of that going on. And also paratrooper operations. It just seems to be completely not on the cards for this Saudi Hadi coalition. And even the Houthis, I mean, I think, what is it? Is it the complexity of operating paratroopers just too much for these people to sort of engage in? I mean, there's too much training, too much specialist equipment, too much preparation, too expensive. I mean, what is it that stops them from sort of like carrying out airborne operations like that? But anyway, I mean, it's all fairly irrelevant, but I think you can sort of consider these things and consider, how would the Americans change this, and I don't want to just say the Americans, I'm just picking on them as a sort of a Western power. But they do have a more of a reputation for sort of modern thinking and dynamic warfare, and really going to grounds with the way they carry out operations like that. I can't remember what it is, but I think it's sort of it's a doctrine of I can't remember what it is, but it's basically a doctrine of mobile warfare that is sort of makes a greater use of not I don't want to say sort of combined arms, but that's the way they think. When I say don't want to say combined arms, what I'm talking about there is full combined arms now is far more complex in the range of it. They're bringing in a lot of not so much carpet bombing, but air warfare, computer operations, that sort of thing, electronic counter operations. They'd be doing things like that. These special things that only these sort of Western powers can really sort of start doing. I mean, it reminds me of that Uganda, Tanzania event where the Tanzanians got on their radio and started saying, are the Americans ready on the western flank? Yes. Are the Soviets ready on the eastern flank? Yes. And are the I don't know. There's another. They're just sort of like saying all this stuff about assuming that there were like lots of other units there, and the Ugandans heard it on their radio. They picked it up because they were listening in, and they all ran away. I mean, what's to stop the Saudis from sort of like double bluffing these units to think they're attacking here and then they're going to attack there, and you don't seem to get a lot of that cleverness in this war or any of these wars. At least none that's really sort of apparent or is being reported. And maybe they are, but I think that to some extent that sort of thinking is quite advanced, and I think you've got to sort of consider the fact that neither of these sides are really up to that level of thinking to any sort of major degree. And even when you read the things that happened in the Second World War, the complexity of deception is mind blowing, really, in many regards. And yet, do we see a lot of that here? I mean, how are they deceiving each other? I mean, are we going to see a headline saying, massive Houthi withdrawal from Hadi after Saudi coalition tricked them into retreating, or vice versa. So anyway, these are just sort of general thoughts, really. I don't want to I want to really just go on and do a Houthi turn and sort of think, well, what can they do? Well, I'm not going to really sort of go to ground with this, but we've got drones. But we've also got artillery. We've got one there, one there, one there. It looks like there was a lot, doesn't it? It looks like there's like massive stacks of artillery, but in actual fact there's only 3. And they're only got a range of 2. So, can we do something? To be quite honest, not really. We've got anti-tank. But I think we really want to be considering what we can do. Got 3 in there. Well, it looks like the heat's going down over here, so let's see what we can do here. Can we get anything in there? Looks like we can. Okay, well, let's go for this armoured unit. See, this is the thing with the Houthis. They seem to have a lot of this anti-tank technology, and the question is where they're getting it from. It's the same in all civil wars, where they're getting their weapons from. And I think I picked that up in earnest from the writing of whatever his name is in the Greek Civil War. They write this, the fundamental definitions that define how, a rebel force can operate. They need a base of operations, they need a supply of money, they need a supply of weapons, they need a supply of food. And, capturing a city is often the first part of that, but in the Greek Civil War they didn't really have that, but they had countries that were supporting them. And I think in this instance you've got to say, well, where are they getting their stuff from? And it has to be a country, and Iran seems pretty key in that. But they could be getting them from Russia, they could be getting them from any sympathetic Middle Eastern entity, and I don't really know the politics enough to be able to sort of suggest any others, but they could be getting them from China. That's just a wild guess. Medical aid, but they do hold cities. But whenever I think of that, I'm daydreaming now, I think of Stalingrad, because they did have manufacturing facilities in Stalingrad, and of course they had them in Mosul as well. And 5.1. So we've just been sitting there making YouTube videos of missiles that go and attack these tanks, and we just pretty much devastated that. And those videos are what is going to change the game to some extent, because they've just taken hideous losses on their armoured unit, which was far too close to the front with these units. They're obviously in range. Can we get this artillery in range? .9 to get there. So we should be able to get him in there. But he's got no more movement. Didn't want to do that. But the thing is, if you look there, there's no road there. It goes like that. It's a bit odd. Okay. Can we hit anything? 1. Well, we really want to be going for this stack. Can we hit it? Probably not. No. Okay, well, why not? Better than nothing. Avoid overstacking if we can. See. See, that's sort of what I'm thinking about. I mean, if you leave it empty, if they had some air mobile units, they could just paratroop straight in there. Now, these are the ones that are going to give us a bit of an edge. We have to go around. Reinforce this line. About that. Flying. Just for the sake of it, let's leave these places occupied with something. I'm not going to push anything else back, so I'm not going to do another turn, but I think that gives you a sort of an idea of what can happen. So it's going to be a real meat grinder. You know, and I think when you sort of consider what I've been talking about, you know, the ability to take losses, I don't think that, you know, the Saudis have really got to be careful about how they do it. Drones. I think one of the interesting things here, we're seeing a lot more of this sort of remote controlled stuff going on. If we get this attack on this tank, no effect. You know, we're seeing a lot of emerging technology, and one of the things that sort of surprised me, it hasn't sort of surprised me, I mean, from the point of view, I haven't done the deterrent, Operation Deterrent 2, the recent alleged Houthi assault on the oil platform, and on the oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, which has been quite high profile. But you know, these sorts of things are sort of, you know, where things are going, the sort of strategic sort of, you know, precision guided munitions, etc., etc. And I might do that scenario, but I've done the first one, and there's not much to it, but it's historically significant. I mean, you know, it's looking to be a turning point that could, you know, turn into something, you know, fairly major between the US and Iran. The one thing I've seen some people sort of talking about whether they came from Iran or whether they came through Kuwait or whether they came from Yemen or whether they were Houthi, you know, originated. And to be quite honest, I think everything is just, you can't believe anything you read. You know, it's just sort of, or, you know, why would the Iranians do something so blatantly, you know, aggressive, you know, in the knowledge that it'd probably bring about untoward American aggression. And if it was the Houthis, why didn't they make it clear that it was them by having a video, showing them launching the missiles, as they quite often do? They bless the missiles, and they videos watching them go off, and then they see, I haven't really seen any of that because I haven't been looking into it too much. But the thing that came to my attention was that, okay, let's supposing it is the Iranians, and they just don't care anymore. I started thinking, well, it's a fairly bold move, and I say bold in aggressive and sort of bolshy, so to speak. But I was sort of thinking, well, why would they do that? And I think one of the things is that what they're clearly stating, and it does change things, because the Americans always think, well, this superpower, obviously they're going to be able to do a lot of damage to Iran in the same way they did to Iraq. But the thing with Iran, as opposed to Iraq, is Iran is a much bigger country. It's going to be a lot harder for them to do anything because of the terrain and the sheer scope. That's the problem that the Iraqis had when they invaded Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. It was just too vast. The Iranians could fall back on so much. But the point I'm trying to get to really is that it's a big country. They're quite powerful. They're obviously preparing for some sort of conflict. But the point I'm trying to get to is, if they do something like that, the Saudi facilities, the Saudi nation is probably going to get pulverized. If they can do this to these oil refineries with the pinpoint precision that the aerial photographs suggest, if the Americans do anything against the Iranians are just going to retaliate and probably wipe Saudi Arabia's oil production facilities off the face of the earth. And it is actually a sort of a consideration as to what would actually happen. And you might have these two exchanges, and then the UN would come in, and how much damage can the Americans do to the Iranians that would actually have any long-term impact, considering the sanctions and the state of play, in comparison to the devastation that they can cause Saudi Arabia, that the Saudi Arabians simply don't want. I have read today that they're actually considering buying the S-300 air defense system from Russia, something along those lines. I mean, not that that's really done much in Syria, but it's all sort of interesting, really. Sort of think, well, are they really actually, is that really going to happen? And I don't know. And they're always talking about the Third World War, but I am to think that consideration, the fact that whatever happens, Saudi Arabia would not come off too well. And I think, secondly, it could be another big thing, because Israel would equally suffer. I mean, they've got their Iron Dome, but really, I mean, what would that do if the Iranians chose to sort of target them in some capacity? The Israelis have been targeting Iranian targets in Syria and Iraq almost indiscriminately, without any sort of challenge. They seem to have airstrikes going in, and why don't they stop them? And well, presumably they can't, and they're scared to, because they don't want to start World War III. But what would happen if the Americans did strike Iran? Would Iran strike Israel? And this is one of the things that I think a lot of people just don't really consider, is that there are people living in these places, and they're probably terrified right now of, it's just a little bit of, pushing and shoving with, ballistic missiles, and, is it Hiroshima? I mean, it's basically wiped off the surface of the planet during the Iran-Iraq war. Mosul, Raqqa, Apello. I can never remember what it's called. All these cities that basically don't exist anymore. These are sort of big considerations. I know this because I sort of quite often consider the possibility that places that I have an interest in Europe are attacked, and it's easy for the Americans to sort of sit there, because they're not going to actually get any of the fallout. I mean, I'm not talking about nuclear fallout. I'm talking about the exchange. I mean, it's not as though any of their little villages and towns are going to sort of be hit by a stray missile. Whereas all these places in Saudi Arabia, I mean, there are going to be places out there that will be heavily bombarded, and the same in Israel, and so I don't know. I just find it hard to believe that that will lead to a major war, but it does seem to be that they use the word tension, and it seems that this concept of tension just seems to be without limit. They just sort of, the tension seems to increase continually, and does it have a finite point at which there will be some sort of explosion, at some point? And it just seems that you cannot push something continually too far without something snapping, and then everyone's saying, "Well, we couldn't have predicted that." You get this idea that you wake up one morning and there's these CNN reports of US airstrikes coming in. The skies of Iran are alight, and then sort of, what does Russia do? And this escalating news story that seems to have been so in our face for so long, actually materializing. And you sort of think, well, I can't really see that happening, but it's just so stupid how things can be so in our face, and yet we all act surprised when they actually happen. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. It's just a sort of a little exercise in sort of meat grinding, I suppose. There's a lot of scope in there for a really intense sort of like hex and counter exchange, especially when you start considering this. So if you fancy playing that through, you can play it solo, you can play it player versus player over the internet once you're a member, and you might have some fun. I'll speak to you later. Cheerio.